Hello and welcome to the short video for Class 16, Introduction to Philosophy, Summer 2024 edition. So the stuff for Class 16 is metaphysics. And very concisely, metaphysics is about what is. What is the nature and structure of reality, if it has any nature or structure. And there's all kinds of interesting philosophical problems in here, such as the problem of universals, which is the question in metaphysics of what is it that makes entities that are in classes of things, say humans or colors, like whatever color this is, bad with colors, what is it that groups these things? Like what do all shirts have in common to make them shirts, if anything? And various philosophers such as Plato, etc., have come up with various answers. For Plato, it would be, this is a shirt, because it kind of like somehow, as we saw before, uplinks, communes with, participates in the form of shirt. Other philosophers, of course, give different answers. Another common area of metaphysics is looking at questions about things like space and time, and space-time. So metaphysics is about all the stuff that is or might be. Things like multiverses, which used to be super popular until DC and Marvel basically beat them into the ground. But that's an area of metaphysics. Are there other worlds besides our own, not other planets, but other realities, planes, etc.? And of course, strictly speaking, questions about God would be in metaphysics, about the nature of God, etc. Now, when people do metaphysics, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Philosophy's got all kinds of different methods depending on what time period in history you're looking at and what location and what type of philosophers. Now, modern metaphysics done kind of in the United States generally, I mean, again, there's always going to be thousands of exceptions. Everyone does things differently, but kind of the method that I learned in grad school long ago was very much like economics. What you would do is you do a plus minus analysis, and when you build your theory, you're trying to explain something. You're trying to say explain how the problem universals could be solved. Like what is it that makes different things fall into the same category? And kind of the calculation would be you look at the positives to the theory, things that increase its value. Then you look at the minuses, things that increase its cost. And in the metaphysical methodology, briefly go through kind of that system of assessment. And one of the classic ones in there, it's kind of interesting, is Occam's razor. This is guy Occam who came up with this thing called the razor. Supposedly, some dispute about that apparently these days. And the idea was to not multiply entities beyond necessity. And kind of a similar thing is the idea to keep things simple. The idea is that, simpler is better. In the case of Occam's razor, if you can explain something with less metaphysical stuff, then that's better. Also applies in things like physics too. If you can explain, say, the universe with, less, stuff, and it works, as well or better than a theory that has more stuff, then that's better for the more economical theory. And so the idea is essentially you slice things away that you don't need with Occam's razor. Now, some think that Occam developed his razor on the idea that God works in simple ways, it doesn't go needlessly complicated. And so it's somewhat ironic that one of the standard kind of atheism 101, in addition to the problem of evil, is using Occam's razor against God. The usual argument goes, well, if you look at the world, you can get the world doing what it does without God. And people could focus, for example, on evolution. And they would say that all you need is, DNA, creatures reproducing, natural selection, and then you get evolution. You don't need a designer to get this stuff. And so that would be an Occam's razor against God. And of course, people have counters to the Occam razor arguments in favor of God, and the battle goes on. Now, the first sort of broad problem we'll look at we looked at the problem of universals. We talked about Plato. We'll look at the question of personal identity. And it involves these questions. One part, of course, it's personal in the sense that it asks the question, what is a person? Not legally, because legally the answer is pretty easy. It's whatever the people who control the people with guns, whatever their opinion happens to be. And all law is just make believe involving whatever people are willing to go along with, or, and of course, most importantly, the people with lots of guns are willing to hurt other people to enforce. And so the legal stuff is interesting to lawyers and has huge implications. For example, in the United States, corporations are considered people, as Mitt Romney said, and that has vast legal implications and economic implications. In, I believe it was Alabama, they recently ruled that embryos are people, and that had all kinds of legal implications as well. But in metaphysics, our focus is not on what lawyers and people with guns are saying about, persons, although that's philosophically interesting. Our concern is with what is it really? What are the qualities that entity has to have to be truly a person? Not as the legal definition, etc. Just simply, what is it, if anything? Because we could be making this stuff up too. And it's pretty tough because coming up with qualities that are such that if you have these qualities, you are a person. And if you are a person, you have these qualities is difficult. It's challenging. People sometimes just say, well, human, just go with human. If you're human, you're a person. And then that becomes a problem because what if there are people that are not humans? I mean, true here on Earth, as far as we know, we're the only people. But of course, there used to be Neanderthals who pretty certainly were people, and technically they're not the same species as us. And of course, if you like, science fiction, fantasy, etc., it's easy to imagine species that are, we would say, yeah, they're people, but they're not human. And so working out what it is to be a person, morally, ethically, legally, difficult. And of course, the metaphysics, difficult too. And it's important because, as we can see, it can have legal implications. It also has moral implications, etc. So one big question is, metaphysically, what is a person? The other part, of course, is the identity part. And this is the question of, what is it to be the same person across time? Because being a person is supposed to persist across time. So I think, for example, that I'm the person who did the work, over the past couple of weeks. And so when that, paycheck check gets digitally deposited into my bank account, I believe that I earned that because I'm that person. But what is it that connects, this with that past being? And that's a question of personal identity across time. The other part, of course, of identity is what makes me distinct from not only all other people, but all other things. So what makes me and not, say, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or what makes me not, this microphone? And you might say, well, that seems kind of obvious. You're not the microphone. But the question is, what is it metaphysically that does that? What makes me distinct from all other things? And so in answering those questions, philosophers come up with all kinds of different answers, shockingly. So the first dead guy we'll look at is our good dead friend, John Locke. He goes into depth on the question of what is a person. He comes up with a fairly detailed answer to this. Basically, it involves reason and reflection, being conscious, thinking, etc. Not surprisingly, philosophers generally tend to go with kind of a thinking definition of personhood, that creatures who have reason, that's a key part to being a person. And then there's questions about what if you have the potential to have reason, like if you're talking about, say, embryos, etc., or they people, because they can become rational beings. How does it all work? It becomes super complicated. So Locke, in terms of the question of what is a person, he provides this definition that he thinks is good. And of course, you can always argue it. And in terms of what is it to be, what is it makes the person across time and different from all of the things, he goes through quite a bit and has some interesting discussions, some that have some interesting sci-fi implications about consciousness transfer. But the gist of it is essentially is this. The key to Locke is, what is a person for him? Consciousness. What makes you you? Consciousness. What makes you different from all the things? Consciousness. And so that it for him is the key to personal identity. You are for him your consciousness. Now, in terms of why he's concerned about this, one of the concerns about personal identity as a practical thing is moral accountability. Because intuitively, we generally tend to think that a person should only be rewarded for what they actually have done. And so that's a question of identity. Was I the person who did the good thing? And similarly for accountability for bad deeds, same question. Was I the person who did the bad thing? And so he sees that as the important part of personal identity. And he does tie this into justifying legal punishment, that legally it's only justified in punishing the same person. Now, he's also concerned, of course, with life after death. Another important part of personal identity is the question of, is the person something that could keep on going after death? Could you persist? And Locke believes that, this also ties back to his view of justice. His view is, or was because he's dead, that there will be judgment day. And his belief is, people get resurrected, brought back to life. And of course, for that to be just, it has to be the same person being brought back. And Locke thinks that's what the consciousness does. So if on Judgment Day, God just creates people that look like past people, and you have somebody that looks like Hitler, and someone that looks like, Mother Teresa, and someone looks like, Henry David Thoreau, and someone looks like, some, random nice person from history. And obviously it would be unjust to just punish someone just because they happen to look like Hitler, or reward someone because they happen to look like someone who is a nice person in history. So for Locke, it's got to be the person being brought back. And that's where the consciousness comes in. His view is God basically, boom, resurrection, consciousness gets put back in, Judgment Day, done. And there's also quite a bit more going on there, hence, the various videos. And so the content for 16 is metaphysics. What's it all about? What are some concepts? How do you do metaphysics? At least one version of doing it. Keep in mind, lots of different ways to do philosophy. I just went with the one that I learned in grad school, because that's how I do it. And other people do it differently. Then we'll look at, John Locke's personal identity, and then done with that. So the readings, as always, you can get the notes, readings, paper guide here if you haven't got them already. Coursework is quiz 16, John Locke's theory of personal identity. Quiz, as always, is the usual setup, 5 questions, true or false, available until date, due date, etc. And that's the stuff for class 16. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future. Also, stay hydrated. In this hot temperatures, it's important to stay hydrated.